Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Session 2 of the Summer Institute, Community and Climate Resilience through Bivalves, the Billion Oyster Project. My name is, thank you. Thank you, that's the spirit. My name is Ted Widmer. I've spoken at many of the past Summer Institutes, and such is my devotion to COA and to Darren and to the idea of the Summer Institute that I will speak on just about any topic, including one I'm completely unqualified to speak about, which brings me, of course, to oceanography. I don't know very much about oceanography. I do think it's a fantastic theme for this week. I'm really looking forward to today's session and all of them. I do know a bit about living in New York City, so I'm just going to say that briefly. And we're going to hear about New York's incredible harbor today. I've lived in New York for about 5 years. I teach at the City University of New York, and I came into New York, like everyone, overwhelmed by its size and energy, the size of the buildings, the size of the crowds. But after having lived there for a number of years, I've felt that I now have a sense of its vulnerability, its fragility. It's both. It's got all of these contrasts, and that vulnerability was certainly on display in the early months of COVID, when New York, by virtue of its strength, the size of its population, the nearness of how people live, made it a hotspot for COVID, and also a leading place helping the rest of the country figure out how to get through COVID. But it's also very vulnerable because of where it sits on the water. It's vulnerable to rising sea levels and other forms of climate vulnerability, including environmental forms of injustice. And if it is vulnerable in those ways, it also is succeeding, much as it did with COVID, at helping the rest of the country figure out how to leverage its strengths. And I think New York's great strength is its people, New Yorkers themselves. And I sat next to Tanasia last night, and it was a really inspiring conversation. So I'm looking forward to hearing from her and about the Billion Oyster Project, which is going back to a great historic strength of New York Harbor when it was filled with huge numbers of oysters and famous for them, and people like Tanasia are bringing them back. So we're so grateful. I want to introduce her interlocutor, Steve Milliken. And Steve and I did not consult on the color of our... it just happened the way things always do at the Summer Institute. Steve served as a trustee of COA for a dozen years, and as a judge for more than 20 years in the Superior Court of the District of Columbia. He taught for as long at Harvard Law School's Trial Advocacy Workshop. Following law school and a stint at the Department of Justice, he continued his commitment to indigent defense and legal services as a fellow at the Georgetown University Law Center, then as a founding partner of Milliken, Van Susteren, and Cannon. Now that he's retired from the bench, he works for Justice Aid, whose mission is to leverage the community-building power of art and music to transform awareness into action in the fight against injustice. So please welcome Steve and Tanasia.
Thank you, Ted. And I think we need to begin, as New York always needs to begin, by acknowledging the native lands we occupy. And that's something I've always heard done at COA convenings, and I think it's an important thing to say. And welcome to everyone who's here, and also those who attend remotely to learn about community and climate resistance through Bivalves, and especially the Billion Oyster Project. We welcome Tanasia Swift, who was born and raised in Brooklyn. She went to the New York Harbor School, which you'll hear something about, graduating in the second class, and then she went on to get a degree in environmental engineering. And after some educational and nonprofit service, she went in 2017 to become the field station programs manager of the Billion Oyster Project. So welcome, Tanasia. I am honored
you.
to be in conversation with you.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to talk about my work, so thank you.
If you could just talk about your educational journey, I think it's all of a piece.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so as mentioned, I was born and raised in Brooklyn. And then a joke that we usually say about New Yorkers is that, how do you know someone's from New York? They'll definitely tell you. So I am a native New Yorker through and through. And I was an environmentalist since I can remember, starting out with my father, who was a fisherman slash a crabber. And so if you've been to New York City, you probably know about Coney Island. There's an amusement park, there's an aquarium, there's also a pier, which fishermen typically go. It's a local spot. And that was the hangout spot when I was younger with my dad. And so starting there, I knew that this was something that I was curious about. So my curiosity led me into marine science. And at the time, there was no school in New York City that was teaching students about the waters of New York until 2004, or 2003 rather. So the New York Harbor School. And they give you this big book when you're applying for high schools. They're color-coded by borough. And I saw the name New York Harbor School, and at that time I said, okay, this is the school that I want to go to. And that's exactly what I did. But it was also a huge risk because many of my friends were not going to this school. It was only in its first year. I'm not even sure the teachers knew exactly what they were doing at the time. But it was something I was really interested in. So I went to New York Harbor School. Right now, I'll talk a little bit about what it is now, but it's definitely grown. And it's a maritime high school. From there, I went to study at Stony Brook University, continuing my education in the environmental world. Stony Brook is located on Long Island. And eventually, I decided, okay, I may have to move out of New York City to do what it is that I love. I love the water, I love the harbor, but I realized with some volunteer work that New York City is actually an island, and it also requires work. It also requires environmentalists. And so for a number of years, I worked in the nonprofit world, as mentioned, and eventually led me to being Oyster Project. So some of the things that I'm just passionate about, so community building, social justice, environmental justice, marine biology, and scuba diving. And that's me right there with an oyster reef, and part of an oyster reef in Brooklyn, so the original land of the Lenape. And so as mentioned, I spent a lot of my time on water. So through my work at the Bay and Oyster Project, I am teaching students from New York City about their harbors, about their backyards, and I also spend time just recreationally open water swimming, bringing women to the water through a group that I created, Water Women NYC, and then also scuba diving in New York Harbor. So not only, teaching about oysters, but also changing the perception of what we think of as a living body of water. So that's how I ended up at the Billion Oyster Project.
And can I ask you to back up and say a little more about the New York Harbor School? I think there have been 4 students from the New York Harbor School who've come to the College of the Atlantic. And I think it's a great connection. Murray Fisher, who founded the Harbor School, is someone I introduced to Darren. They hit it off. They have very similar energetic personalities.
Yes.
And can you say a little about the Harbor School experience and what it meant to New Yorkers?
Yeah, for one, Murray
Or what
is,
it means.
he's been phenomenal. Actually, Murray was the first person that I've met when I was applying for Harbor School. He was sitting at a table, and as you mentioned, he's really energetic. He can convince you to do almost anything. And Murray was the person that I, met, and I was like, okay, I know this is a place that I want to be. So as mentioned, New York Harbor School is a maritime-focused high school. So students are learning a variation of different maritime careers. So aquaculture, professional diving, marine systems technology. So it's just as you would take your car to a technician to be fixed if there are issues, boats require the same. Vessel operations, ocean engineering, marine biology research, and marine policy. So at that time, when I went to Harbor School, I'm a little jealous now because we didn't have all of these programs. But we would have weekly field trips to a place around the harbor. So literally, the outdoors, the harbor was our classroom. We take the subway, we take the trains, and I grew up in Bed-Stuy, which is central Brooklyn. And there weren't any bodies of water in that location. So it definitely meant lots of train time. But we did lots of events on schooners, sleeping overboard boats, doing work on the harbor, going to various places, learning about the history of New York City. And from there, that's when my, knowledge of the harbor kind of like grew, and the environment and the people grew. And so now, Harbor School has become a lot more broad. So students, once again, this is a public high school, so you don't have to pay to attend. And the students now are absolutely powerful. They're like a force to be reckoned with. You see them on the boats, they're managing the lines, they're working as crew together without, little direction. They're doing marine biology research, they're scuba diving at our sites where we have oyster reefs. And so sometimes I wish, I can go back and do my whole journey over. But it's an amazing school, and to see how much it's grown since my time there, being the second graduating class to what it is now, has been phenomenal. And then through the aquaculture program, so students were learning about oysters and how to grow oysters. That's how the Bay and Oyster Project essentially came into play. So the founders, once again, Mary Fisher, and the aquaculture teacher at the time, Pete Malinowski, decided, listen, this is something that we can turn into a larger, initiative. And so we took this kind of small ed project and turned it into a nonprofit by 2014. So Bay and Oyster Project is relatively new.
So let's just take that seed of the island COA community and the Harbor School island community and think about how those connections can grow. But let's get to the bivalves, oysters.
Yeah, let's do it.
More about the Billion Oyster Project, how it began, what it does.
Yeah, so the Billion Oyster Project is a nonprofit. We're based out in New York City, as I've mentioned, and we're restoring oyster reefs to New York Harbor through public education initiatives. So not only is it about oysters, but we're teaching and engaging New Yorkers in the process. And so when we speak about why oysters are important or what oysters do for our environment, we talk about three essential things, with one as a bonus. And so those things include filtering water. So oysters are filter feeders. So one of the experiments that students do during their time at Harbor School is taking a tank with oysters, one without oysters, using the same water and watching the clarity as it changes with the tank with oysters. The background that you see here is of an oyster reef that I have a video of later on, so I'll give you a little glimpse and we can dive into this reef a little later. Habitat creation. So just like many other types of reefs, oysters create habitat for many fish and organisms, increasing biodiversity. And oysters also can protect shorelines. So if you're imagining a wave coming to shore, it'll slow down that wave energy before it hits shore, kind of protecting our shorelines. And then the last bonus one that I like to talk about is the cultural relevance to New York City. Oysters were a huge part of New York City's culture, to the point where everyone ate oysters. If you've been to Central Park, I don't know if anyone has been to Central Park or know of it, right? There are lots of hot dog trucks and carts around, ice cream carts. But imagine if there were not those trucks and instead we had oyster carts. And so for 1 penny, you can literally go to a cart and they'll give you an oyster. And those oysters came directly from the harbor. So businesses were not only using those oysters in big fancy restaurants, but you also had oysters that were sold on the streets of just New York. And with time, oysters began to be a hot commodity. I think they say New York City oysters are were the best in the world. So we were shipping our oysters all over, including to the West Indies. So New York City has also a strong relationship to the slave trade as well. And so getting into it, so those of you who've been to New York or even know about New York or heard about New York City, you don't necessarily think of it as an island, right? So this image that we have here is New York City, so Manhattan rather, around the 1600s. So as you can see, there are no buildings, there are no piers, it's marshlands, really soft shorelines, and then with time, New York City essentially became what it is now. So filled with buildings and, of course, cars. I ask students all the time, what do you think of when you think of New York City? And I get a plethora of responses, from pizza to traffic to rats, or, all of these ideas, but no one ever says an island. And that's exactly what it is. And so a part of our work is, once again, changing that perception through oysters, getting communities involved through oysters and education. And so, as I mentioned, the Lenape-Hokan were the original inhabitants of New York City. And in this case, I'll be talking a little bit about Brooklyn, my hometown. And they had no system of land ownership, but did use oysters as a lifestyle, a way that they were using to manage the land. And so even prior to the Industrial Revolution and prior to colonization, the Lenape were here, and they were the first ones using oysters as a way for community building and land management. And I would also be remiss if I didn't mention Thomas Downing, the Oyster King. So a little, nugget of culture here. So Thomas Downing was a famous oysterman, restaurant owner, abolitionist, and business owner from Virginia originally, but he moved to New York City to start a business in oyster, as his oyster restaurant. And so this picture in the center is actually just a walk away from my office. So I work on Governor's Island, but the building where he used to run his business and was part of the Underground Railroad still exists. So these nuggets of history are still existing, but I can imagine how many New Yorkers pass by these locations and don't know or think about what's happening right, in front of them. And many New Yorkers, we walk pretty fast, so we're not even looking at anything. We're just trying to get to where we're going. So much history here. And over time, we've lost over 200 acres of oyster reefs in New York City. And that's about the size of 7 Staten Island. So thinking about the land masses of acres of oysters that we've lost. And this picture here, just so that everyone knows, is not of New York City's oysters, but just to show how oysters began to grow. And what happened to those oysters? So as mentioned, New York City's oysters were a huge part of our food system. And so we were able to look back at old menus and stories, journal articles. Of course, if you were someone navigating along the waterfront, one of the things that you would probably do is journal about your experiences, what you would see. And we take these accounts, read them, instead of having scientific data, but this was the data that we're looking back at to see exactly what was happening to our oysters. And so oysters, once again, were shipped around the world to the point where they began to be over-harvested or overfished. Dredging. So that image that I showed of the 2 Manhattans, and as big barges began to move into New York City, we needed space, so bottom space, for those barges to get through. So they began to dredge out the bottom of the harbor to the point where they were dredging and covering up oyster beds, and then pollution. As more people began to navigate and move through New York City, we needed a place for that pollution and waste to go. And of course, the easy answer at that time was directly into the harbor. But through the Bay and Oyster Project, we're now trying to repopulate oysters. So this is the nice part. I'm not going to make it so such a bad story. But we're bringing people to the water to repopulate those oysters with students, with groups, essentially anyone who wants to get involved. And so just to give a scale of how many oysters we've planted and what we've done since 2014, so we've engaged over 8,000 New York City students alone, about 1.6 million pounds of shells, and 75 million live oysters since the time that Bay and Oyster Project has started. And this year, a bit of good news, we're on track to get to our 100th million oyster for Bay and Oyster Project. So we're trying to get to 1 billion, but we're getting there. And how exactly does this work? So we have a shell recycling program. So if you eat oysters, I don't know if anyone eats oysters or shellfish or any types of marine life, but we recycle our shells from New York City restaurants. So if you've been to New York City within the last couple of years, you ate an oyster, you're probably helping Bay and Oyster Project in our projects. So we recycle those shells, take them to a location where nature acts as a sterilization tool. So the sun, the bugs, the rain essentially takes these shells and creates a brand new clear shell for baby oysters or larvae to attach to. Then we start the spawning and setting process. So that image that should be on your right, what looks like pickled salt pieces are actually all baby oysters. So they start off really tiny, and then with time, they're beginning to grow. We're feeding them food directly from our harbors, and then we're installing them with community members at a local reef site. And so we've taken these storage containers, talk about repurposing. So we've taken these large shipping containers, and we've turned them into these aquaculture tanks. So we have 4 of them at a location in Red Hook. We fill them with oysters, we fill them with water from the harbor, and then essentially we're setting the oysters in these tanks. It's an amazing thing to see in person. And during the hot months, we also use them as a swimming pool, but no one knows that. And so talking also about our shell recycling program. So once again, we'll take a large truck, go around to the restaurants around New York City, collect those shells. Instead of having those shells be dumped into waste, we just take them and repurpose them for our oyster reefs. And oysters, I love this slide because I show it to students all the time. So oysters are extremely resilient because they can stick to almost any hard surface. And so me being sort of like the wanderer that I am, so I was once walking around a location in the Bronx called Pugsley Creek. And just as I was when I was a child, picking up things, looking at it, examining it, saying, oh, this is amazing. As I was walking, I see this goat skull almost perfectly intact. And so I pick it up, and I'm like, okay, this is phenomenal. This is something I probably wanna look at and examine. And then as I pick it up, I see that there is a baby oyster, what we call spat, in the nostril of this goat skull. And I was just amazed by this, oyster just hanging out and living here. But they've been known to attach to various things, from rocks to different types of industrial nails or, pilings that are in the harbor. But the best substrate that they like to attach to is oyster shells. So,
now,
pretty resilient.
we have Ted, the oceanographer, and can you go a little more deeply into structure and precisely the places in which you're working?
Yeah, so once again, Bay and Oyster Project is relatively new. So a lot of it is trial and error. So we use different types of structures depending on the local body of water. So most of the bottom sediment in New York City is sort of what we call black mayo. It's really soft. It's not sandy or granular. So we sometimes have to place structures on top of the surface, or if it is sandy enough, we'll place structures on bottom. So we have various types of structures, from cabinets that are on the bottom to things that float on the surface, to floating platforms, which students at the New York Harbor School, once again, they've helped us build those. And then we work all throughout New York City. I typically get the question, where does Bay and Oyster Project work? And New York City is our target area. So most of our locations are within Manhattan and Brooklyn. We do have a project that is at the southern tip of Staten Island, so the Living Breakwaters Project, which will be a large breakwater. And we have a project that is as far north as the Mario Cuomo Bridge. And so these locations were all selected for various reasons, but some of the locations that I work at are locations where there's a strong community and that we want to get to the water.
So that map outside of the headquarters in Governor's Island looks like your field stations, and that's your job as the manager of that whole project. Tell us about them.
Yeah, it's a lot of area to cover. Sometimes it's a little overwhelming. But a part of my job, so I am considered the Bay and Oyster Project Field Stations Program Manager. So all around New York City, we have these reefs in which we conduct monitorings or going out to collect data with community groups, with students, volunteers, teachers, professors, essentially anyone who wants to come out. And so part of my job is managing these locations, getting students and community groups involved, showing them the ropes, teaching them about the oysters, teaching them about the history of these locations. And also, I get the fun job of being out in the field, so I'm not complaining. And so once again, these locations, the idea is that these reefs are a tool for student research. Our primary participants are students usually around middle school age, and they can use these reefs if they wanted to do research on a particular species, if they're interested in oysters, if they wanted to try out different experiments, and just bringing them and engaging them at the waterfront's edge. So New York City's shoreline is about 520 miles. And when we talk about access, there's not as much access as we would like. And that's due to partly safety, but also because of environmental justice. You know, many people do not have access to the waterfront. And through this work, we're trying to make stewards, so students into stewards of their local waterways, so that they can advocate for access, advocate for safety, advocate for better water quality, and use of these waters to be protected. So just honing in a little bit, so these are some of the field stations that I manage that are active. So West Harlem, Brooklyn Bridge Park, Governor's Island, which is where my office, our hatchery, and the New York Harbor School is located. Coney Island, so once again, if you've been to Coney Island, you probably have seen the pier that's there, but there's a little inlet on the opposite side of the ocean called Coney Island Creek, which has a strong history. Flushing Bay, Bushwick Inlet, Williamsburg, Canarsie, Far Rockaway, and in the center of this map is Bed-Stuy, essentially, just to, once again, give you an idea of how far from the water I grew up. And then Sunset Park, which we'll dive into a little bit later. So just to see, I have some visuals about what this actually looked like on the ground. So Brooklyn Bridge Park is a location where we have oysters or various types of structures. So we have some cages that are hanging from a marina. And the idea with these nurseries is that these oysters would be used for a larger reef installation. We have what's called ORSs, or Oyster Research Stations. And these stations are actually adopted by students. So we train their teachers on how to measure the oysters, you know, a little bit about the oysters, and then we give them their cages, we give them their oysters. We do all the permitting and the back work for them. And then the students become little scientists and are collecting the data. They're sending that data back to us. And it's amazing to see them in the field doing this type of work alongside us. And then we also have what's called these gabions. And the cool thing about this site is that there are gabions that students scuba dive at, and then gabions that are close to the shoreline. So during low tide, you can actually put on some waders, wade out into the water, and interact with these reefs. This is our Williamsburg field station site. And it's fun because not only do we have mini golf, which many people love, but we also have a water quality testing lab. And so one of the issues with New York City's waterways is the fact that we have so much runoff and what's considered combined sewer overflows or outflows. And so what that means is that water that is from our toilets, from our sinks, from our homes, typically is taken to a waste treatment facility to be treated and released. But during heavy rainfalls, it becomes combined with waters that are in our sewers. It combined with waters from our homes. And if those waste treatment facilities do not have enough space, that waste goes directly into our harbors untreated, which increases the amount of bacteria, which means that we cannot swim in the water, which means that we cannot boat in the water after heavy rainfall. And so we created this water quality testing lab. And so what we do here is we have weekly testing. So volunteers test water quality around various locations in the city. They bring those samples to us the same day. And then the next day they can see what the water or bacteria levels are in the harbor for that week. So they're getting relatively real-time results and using those results as a tool for advocating for better water quality, using that as a tool for better access. And so what we're hoping that this water quality testing program will do is, once again, give communities the data that they need to advocate for themselves. And they're doing the data collection basically alongside us. And then the Canarsie Field Station, which is located in Canarsie, Brooklyn, at a peninsula at the sort of like southern tip of, or rather eastern tip of Brooklyn. So we have these cabinets and oysters, pretty large oysters, to the point where they were about the size of my foot. They're like amazingly large. And so once again, these oysters are growing, and I can only imagine, well, I don't know if anyone would want to eat an oyster this big, but they're growing relatively large, just food that's available for them. And just to show you how these oysters are growing, I was impressed. Like, that's my hand there with that oyster. You can see the barnacles on them. So the fact that these oysters are growing so large is absolutely phenomenal.
And can you take us to that Sunset Park station and maybe even take us underwater as a part of this presentation?
I sure can. I love going underwater. So this is our Sunset Park field station. So the Sunset Park field station is near and dear to my heart for various reasons. It has a strong story. It is considered an environmental justice community. So this waterfront, as with most waterfronts in New York City, has gone through the whole industrial side of things, to the point where there weren't people living on the waterfront, to people creating shanty towns and shacks right near the water. And they were prone to, diseases and getting sick because of this access, to the point where we had to bar off people from using this waterway because it was so polluted. And so at this site, this is an aerial shot of what some of the oyster reefs look like here. So we have these oyster reef cabinets. Once again, during low tide, we can wade out into the water. Students can put on their waders, interact with the oysters. We can see what they look like. We also have bags of oysters here as well. And we have a deep water reef, which is one of the sites that this past couple of weeks, I know Steve was trying to get in contact with me, and I'm in the water. The day that you called, I actually had my phone near the shoreline. Tide came up, kind of had a little bit of water damage. So, but it's an amazing site. So students are scuba diving here. And so just to once again go back to some of the histories of Bush Terminal Park, which is the park that we were, working in, you can see that it's, really industrialized. So this is the 1900s. So boats and barges were bringing in different types of goods to New York City. And there's also a railroad that goes around the perimeter of New York City. So these barges would come in, take the goods around the railroad system, and stop at various industrial places around the harbor. This is Bush Terminal in 1983. So you can see it's changed a little bit. In the two lagoons that are on the right side of your screen is where we do our work, to what it looks like now. So people, once again, having access to the waterways. And the fact that there are so many organisms and life here that many people who live around this area were not either familiar with or knew existed is part of the reason why I enjoy doing my work. So once again, thinking about oysters as habitat creators. You have different fish and flounder and different organisms, to the point where the biodiversity is increasing, and now we have things like whales and sharks and dolphins that are coming closer into shore. And when I tell people that, they're like, whales? Did you say whales? I'm like, yes, whales. Not in this lagoon, but closer into shore. So I just wanted to shout out, I have two interns who are working with me this summer, who are also New York Harbor School students. So Summer and Julia. So Julia is actually, the young woman on the left there, she is studying marine biology research at the New York Harbor School. And Summer is studying marine policy at the New York Harbor School. And so they were able to come out with me, help out with oyster research, collection of data, and the fact that, look, their faces say it all. They, having experience near the water and having these skills has been extremely beneficial to so many young people, and introducing them to these careers and knowing that you don't have to leave New York City, I think has been a huge pleasure in the work that we do. Some more photos. So students and family members. So we work with this community group called Sunset Spark. And so being Oyster Project, though we have all of these locations and field stations, we work really closely with community groups. They are the stewards of their waterways. They are the knowledge holders. And so we work really closely with them to help put on these programs. And so Sunset Spark, they work with communities of Spanish and Hispanic background, and we're getting them on the water. They do a lot of STEM programs for these students. And they did a boating program, just last year. And once again, We've gone from a water body that people really had little to no access to now they're boating and kayaking and canoeing in these waterways. And then also to New York Harbor School with their graduates now who are scuba diving with us at Bush Terminal Park. So once again, seeing that these students are actually out there in the field, it's not just learning in the classroom from a textbook, but they're literally doing these skills out into the field, helping to collect the data, and it's absolutely fun just to see them in action. And now let's get into the fun part. So I have a few clips that I've taken while scuba diving or just at our sites in New York City. 2 of them are at Bush Terminal Park, just so that you can get a sense of what these oyster reefs look like. And so, opposed to oysters that you use for farming or consumption, our oysters, we don't consume them. The water is not, best for consumption.
Yet.
Well, we don't know how many years that's gonna take, but not yet. So let's just dive right on in. So the first video that I'm gonna show is oysters at our Sunset Park field station. You can see they're growing large. You can see that they're creating this habitat basically on their own. There are some mussels and mud snails and different organisms just kind of like crawling around in the crevices. And I love it because what you see while you're standing or from the harbor pulling things up is very different when you're underwater and you're just still and you're just watching little critters kind of like poke their heads out and then go back in. So you might not see it too closely here, but just imagining how amazing this would be just as you're underwater. Okay. And there are oysters. Lots of mud snails, red and green algae, red sponges. And that visibility, though visibility generally is not great, oysters are filtering the water, so right around the reef you see relatively clearly. And then the next video I love, once again the same site, but you can see schools of fish just like swimming right over the reef. Maybe you'll even catch a comb jelly, a jellyfish that's there as well. So let's get into that one. And you can see the sponge, so that orange structure just on the bottom of the screen, just growing there. You can also see the sediment that's at the bottom of the harbor as well. There goes the school of fish. There goes that comb jelly at the bottom. This is during a low tide, so this is actually about 5 feet. So not very deep at all.
We were wondering if people were going to have questions. They're irrepressible.
Yeah. But at this site, I absolutely love it. There are a ton of I geek out about different fish and organisms. But there are a ton of flounder, and it's amazing. And I tell students about the types of life that lives here in our harbors, to the point where there's a location at Brooklyn Bridge Park where we're seeing seahorse. And there were many seahorses this past year. So students imagining they're pulling up their oyster research cages, and then out plops this fish, and you're like, what is this? And it's actually a seahorse. And so we were scuba diving at a site next to JFK. So if you're going to New York and you're flying into JFK, look for this sort of like body of water. It's called Jamaica Bay. And we're scuba diving there. That's a site where we have a project of oyster reefs. And as we descend, visibility, once again, you'll see that it's mostly green. But as we descend, we see a line where we have some of our structures connected to. And then just wrapped around that rope was a seahorse with his tail just like coiled neatly around that line. And I have my dive weight. I'm like trying to like breathe through my regulator. But I'm going to stop talking so everyone can see the video. My dive buddy is actually a New York Harbor School graduate as well. Oyster shells at the bottom, and then there it is. And I'm like looking up at my dive buddy, like, did you see that? like, this is phenomenal. So I'm literally like geeking out probably more than like the students at some points, but I always tell them, keep your parties inside. You know, you can have the excitement, but keep your party inside. But it's so hard when you're seeing and you've grown up in New York City and you've never seen these, you know, oysters or organisms before, to the point where I've seen my first humpback whale in New York City, just off of the coast. And so the fact that these organisms, oysters, are coming back, and we have students using the outdoors and the harbors as their classroom, and the fact that students know that they don't have to leave New York City to be marine biologists, to study, you know, environmental science, to be advocates, is something that I think is extremely powerful. And so with that said, I, you know, want to thank everyone for being here. So, thank you.
Before we turn to questions generally, I have to pause to reflect that so much of the experience we have is of talking heads, and what this brings home to me is the from Sean. Tanasia, COA is a community of human ecologists, and several students have come to COA from the Harbor School. Can you speak to the importance of education, empowerment, and giving urban youth opportunities to pursue careers they might otherwise not have had a chance to pursue?
Yeah, I think that's always a great question. So one of the things that I advocate for is just exposure to different things, right? So the more exposed that a student is to various types of careers, they'll have an opportunity to choose what it is that they like or they don't like. So they can say, okay, I've tried that, I'm not interested, but this is something that's new, as opposed to the careers that we probably learn in elementary school. So, oh, you can be, not saying that being a teacher or being a fireman or a policeman is something that is looked down upon, but we want to expose them to different types of careers early on. And then with that exposure, you know, if there's something that you care about, so once again, using myself as an example, having the experience on the water with my father was essentially the seed that planted in me to start and really want to become a marine scientist. And so having these seeds planted at a relatively young age creates this trickling effect, this pipeline of students going into these careers, and not only for the career, but also becoming advocates. So also thinking about that many city dwellers, once again, they're, you know, not aware of certain regulations or how to become an advocate, or the fact that when you're trying to advocate for yourself, and if you don't have the data or resources to speak about it, you may feel unequipped or not be able to do that. And so I think having New York Harbor School and then just students from all over New York City, community members participating, is very powerful, because I see New York City becoming more of a waterfront classroom and changing how we teach. And everyone doesn't teach the same. You know, some people, I am not great with sitting down with a textbook and taking information and regurgitating. I would rather do and learn very hands-on. So I think it's another way for teaching. It gets students out into the field. And we need more environmentalists from the city as we think about climate change and those who are impacted by climate change. It's not those that are living in more rural or wetland areas. You know, climate change is affecting us all. And the more diverse we have in terms of solutions to climate change, and realistically, you know, those who are in underrepresented communities are the ones who are facing the strongest effects of climate change. And so having them participating in our work hopefully will become advocates and become the next climate change thought leaders in this world. So diverse thoughts, having the experience, having careers, and then passing that down hopefully to next generations is definitely something we need in this world.
Thank you. Are there, Wes, Sean, I'm counting on you.
Hi. Folks, speak into the mic. Yesterday, the virtual didn't quite pick up the audio, so just speak right into it. Thanks.
Okay. Hi. Thank you for that talk. That was really inspiring. If you could talk a little bit more about sort of what you were just talking about with that educational outreach, what does that look like? What are the relationships you have with schools, with teachers? How often do kids come out and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, definitely. So Bay and Oyster Project, we have an education department. And so we do a couple of things. We have a few resources that we use for teachers. And so we have this model that is basically train the teacher or train the trainer. And so we put on various types of trainings and professional developments for mostly educators and teachers, but once again, open to community scientists as well, where teachers can learn about oysters. They're learning about oysters in the harbor. We give them the tools that they need. So the cages, calipers, which are rulers, oysters, and they're going out and giving these resources or working with their classrooms at these locations. We also provide curriculum, which is completely free to teachers. And so there are certain standards or sequences that teachers have to abide by if you're a Department of Education teacher. And so the great thing about the curriculum that we create is that it's not learning about a location that's far away from home, but it's a location that's literally in their backyards. And they can take this curriculum and replace it for something that they would normally teach. So instead of having a lesson plan that, is about somewhere in, California, they're taking our supplemental lesson plan and just inserting it in. And so that way you're still meeting those requirements for the sequencing that you need to do. And then students have experiences in the field. So we provide, through the Field Stations program, our season basically for outdoor work is essentially from May through November. We do have a few tough students who like to go out in January, but it's like the dead of winter and it's extremely cold. But they have the opportunity to not only come out to stations where we're providing the programs, but once again, where they are the ones going out to their sites, pulling up their cage, collecting the data, and then at the end of the school year, we put on a science symposium. So students of all ages, I think our youngest research student was in pre-K. And it was adorable. And so they're literally coming in and just like science style, they're presenting the research that they've been doing for the year with other students, with teachers, with professionals in the field. And to see them talk so passionately about their work and see them so confidently has been phenomenal. So professional developments, curriculum that they can use, field experiences with us, opportunities to do research. And whenever we do a new lesson plan, we'll create sort of like a pilot program where teachers can essentially come. We'll do a small group of teachers to pilot it and try it out with their students and then help, give feedback for our next, iteration of that lesson plan. So.
Great question, thank you.
I'm wondering if you have a network of alums who come back to talk with the students in the Harbor School, and also if your program has spread to other central city schools that might benefit from a similar program.
Yeah, so great question. So one of the things that we try to do with our alumni is provide them with resources. So I don't know if I've mentioned this when I was speaking about Harbor School, but Harbor School is what most would consider a trade school, but it's a career and technical education, or CTE school. So at the end of their 4 years, students receive a certificate that allows them, if they would like to go directly into that field of choice. So students in the professional diving program, they receive their dive certificates. Students who are in the marine systems technology, they become welders. So some go directly into the field and become welders. Some become, crew and captain on various ships around the harbor. Some of my friends who I went to harbor school with are driving the ferries that I sometimes ride to work. So it's really interesting to see what they're doing now. And of course, there are some who decide, okay, this wasn't for me, but it was fun. So they're not in the field. So we have these things called peer, essentially panels. And so allowing professionals and harbor school alum to come back and talk to the students about their experiences. And so we know that environmental careers are not always the most welcoming or easy to get into. And so I think having real conversations with students about what that looks like, how to get through it, giving them advice from professionals is something that we try and strive to do. And literally creating internships through Big Oyster Project so that they have a means to start. And so we try to track as much as we can where the alumni go after Harbor School. And then just recently, so just last year, there was a school in Red Hook, a middle school, that we have been trying to become the Harbor Middle School, which it is now. And so instead of having students introduced in high school, students were creating this pipeline so that they're introduced to these careers in middle school, then hopefully going on to go to Harbor School, and then spreading out, from there, and hopefully they'll stick with it. And in terms of if there are programs or schools that are associated with us or similar to Harbor School is definitely one of a kind in New York City. And not because I went there, but definitely it's a one of a kind high school, and it's also a public high school. So I don't know if there's other schools that have taken on that same model of career, really hands-on field experience, but it's something that I think many schools around the country, especially in large cities, should look into, because once again, it starts to create this pipeline of environmentalists from various backgrounds.
Pam, and I have to give a shout out, another great New York outdoor educator, if I can see through these lights to call you out. Is there another question?
Thanks very much. I love to geek out as well, and it's so wonderful to see all the field stations that you've created, and in doing so, giving students access to these environments. My question's around climate change, and on the west coast of Canada in particular, last year we had what was called a heat dome, and on the coast we just saw everything cook in a matter of hours, and subtidally temperatures unprecedented. You've got these wonderful sentinels for environmental change now with your field stations. Are you measuring temperature and things like that to be able to track some of the consequences of the changes that we expect to see?
Right, so we are collecting data from various parameters. So we're looking at not only, pH levels, nitrates, temperatures, of course, visibility and various, diversity. And once again, so Bay and Oyster Project is relatively new. So when we're talking about change, we're looking at a large span of time. And so being such a new organization, it will definitely take time to see those trends that are not seasonal, but long-term trends. And so our first reef was installed in 2016. So once again, relatively new, but we are collecting that data. And then every year, we missed last year because of COVID and all of that. We put out these annual data reports. So if folks from the community want to use those reports once again for advocacy to make changes, they can. So we share these reports every year on our website. It has data about our sites and our reefs. But one of the things that we're trying to do is definitely expand around all of New York City and looking at the entire picture, because we have sort of like a snapshot of what's happening. And I think one of the largest indicators of success that we have been able to see is through oyster growth and, of course, the biodiversity aspect. But one of the things that we want to also look into is that water quality. But that may not change, essentially, if the things that we do on land isn't changing. So the more that we continue to have that pollution and waste dumped into our harbors, it's sort of like, you're trying to move forward, but there are things continuing to push us back. So yes, we are collecting that data, and hopefully we'll have, years of data that can help, the next decision makers decide what are some of the solutions to fighting climate change.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your work. Two quick questions, I hope. One, what do you do with the oysters if they can't be eaten? Is there a way to turn them into, I don't know, animal feed or some sort of powder, or I don't know what you do with them. I'd love to know. And also, is there a way to help teachers? I know it's so difficult for them to leave their classroom, to organize, get their kids together. Is there some way that they can get pay for that or extra time? And also, what do you do in the winter?
Yeah, definitely. So the first question, so once again, we do not consume the oysters that we plant out into the harbor. So New York Harbor is considered a closed body of water, which means you cannot harvest, you cannot consume any shellfish from New York City's waters. And there's a hefty fine if you get caught doing it. So we have to go through an extensive permitting process in order to get our reefs permitted. And so sometimes that can be 3 months to an entire year. So we're not consuming any of the oysters that we plant out into the harbor. And so we plant them for the ecosystem benefits to help with, once again, the filtering of nutrients, to help with increasing biodiversity as an educational tool. So once they're planted out at a location, at a field station, we collect data essentially once a month with students, and then in the fall and the spring, and then we go out, we leave those reefs there as is, and students are able to come out into the field and learn about oysters through these reefs. So we kind of like leave them be once they're installed. And then in terms of the second part of your question, I'm sorry, repeat. Teachers, yes. Great question. So many, teachers, if you are taking students on a trip, the logistics around bringing students to the waterfront is probably a little crazier than you may think it is. Students, once again, either have to go on the train, just like I did when I was younger, or get a bus. So teachers can either get students to take a school bus, but there are times during the middle of the day when school buses aren't in use that they can use the free bus, but that also means that they have to get back before like 2:30. And so one of the things that we've tried to implement in some of our grants is giving teachers, stipends for their time. And then, not to be completely honest, having students near the water can be extremely scary, especially for someone or an educator who, this is not their forte. So a lot of it is convincing teachers, I think, mostly teachers are on board, administration, that this is something that would be enjoyable. We have safety protocols for these things. And so getting them on board with that is sort of like the first step, getting them hopefully stipends to bring teachers out into the field, and then also working really closely, trying to work with the DOE to make these things approved as part of their lesson plans. And once again, hopefully every New York City student and every school will be able to use the outdoors as their classroom. So just as you mentioned, getting them paid through stipends, having them participate in their own research station so they can go to a site that's nearest to them are some of the ways that we sort of like alleviate some of that. And then also sometimes that may mean getting them just transportation through like a chartered bus to come out to a site. So.
I heard a little bit in that question about waste, and I remember Bill McDonough came and spoke at the college one time saying when you think about throwing things away, there is no away.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious around your endeavors, is there a waste issue?
So one of the things that I can think of immediately is our shell recycling program. So once again, if you've eaten oysters in New York City, most likely those shells, instead of going into the waste, we just recycle them. So there's large mounds on Governor's Island, which is where our office is, and it kind of like look like mountains of shells. It's super cool, but sometimes we get forks and other things that do not belong there, the hot sauces and the marinara sauces. And so we use those shells as a new way to create that habitat. So we're taking what would normally be waste and turning it into the new substrate for our oysters. One of the misconceptions is that those shells will become the new shells of the growing oysters. But oysters, essentially, they create their own shells, a new shell, by pulling calcium from the water column to do that. So that's one of the things that we are looking into. And then in terms of aquaculture and like some of the structures that we use, we're trying to move away from plastic materials, and sometimes the materials that we use are not as environmentally friendly. So we're also working with different regulatory agencies to say, hey, this is where we want to go in terms of some of our structures. But of course, there are some concerns around not being able to remove a reef as easily if the oysters are not contained in a structure. So once again, we're looking at different ways that we can combat that. So it's a struggle that we're slowly but surely, getting folks on board, and I think definitely where the community can come on board and also advocate for us as well.
Oh, thanks. Tanasia, I love your work and what you've been able to accomplish. And it's part of really the surprise story of the improvement in New York waters. And you mentioned humpback whales, and I thought you'd like to know that research associate of Allied Whale, the marine mammal study group here, Ann Zoidis, was lead author of a study that was published in Continental Shelf Research last year that described the abundance and density of the 6 large whale populations occurring in the New York Bight.
Wow.
And just this month, the Journal of Marine Biological Association of the United Kingdom published a paper based on their observations based on observations from 2011 to 2018 on the site fidelity of humpback whales in the New York Bight. And this includes the entry waters to the New York, New Jersey ports. And they've found that many of the whales are returning year after year and staying in the New York Bight for months at a time. So you and your students will have more opportunities as years go by to look at them, I hope.
Yeah,
Thank you for
definitely.
everything.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, now we're starting to see, you know, just from the beaches, and you're standing at the beach, so not even having to go on a boat, but literally seeing whales breaching off the coast of the Rockaways. It's been phenomenal. So seeing that these, you know, animals, these large animals are coming back. I've also had, outside of New York City, an interaction with a juvenile humpback off the coast of California. And to see how large these animals are in person has been phenomenal. Literally came out of the blue, you know, showed up and doing flips and, you know, circling around us, looking literally directly in our eyes. It definitely creates, you know, the harbor and our waters as a living ecosystem. And the fact that the students are able to start to see this is definitely exciting for me, because I'm like, I told you, see, look what's happening. So I think that's definitely exciting. So thank you for sharing that.
Yes, and I'm remiss in failing to mention that Lindsay Jones, research scientist with Allied Whale, is one of the authors, the co-authors of the recent article.
Nice.
So.
All we need to remember with our vast understanding of ocean science, Brother Whitmer, is that Tanasia did all that.
If you were to return in 5 years and address the Institute, what are your hopes for what you'll be telling us about progress in the program? And second, having observed your skills for 1 hour, have you any interest in politics?
Okay, so I think there are lots of things when it comes to measuring success. Of course, there is the sciences and how the oysters are growing. I'm hoping that within the next 5 years, we'll start to see more wild populations of oysters, so oysters that we haven't planted around the harbor start to show up. Hopefully, there's more modeling too, so students can essentially start to model where these oysters would go, where they'd naturally go. And then also from one of the things that I'm really interested in, seeing how the perception of New York Harbor will change. And I see that as sort of like, it's sort of like a juggle, because as more people begin to have these interactions with water, waterfront gentrification is also a concern. Barring off people from going to the water for, you know, those who are, you know, in high rises and literally not having access anymore for the groups that we literally fight to have access to the water too. But hopefully that will not be a concern, and then we'll have students and folks advocating for access, advocating for the environment within the next 5 years, and seeing how people think of New York's waters. Hopefully we'll have more protections around small local water bodies. And then in terms of the politics question, sometimes yes and no. I'm always convincing students to go into policy. So one of the groups that I didn't speak too much about here today, so I have this community group that I created 2 years ago called Water Women NYC. And a part of having this organization was just like, when I was growing up, I'm usually the only one at the beach actually swimming in the water. Everyone else is like sunbathing, or they have, you know, their bathing suits. And so a part of this group is bringing people to the water to create a connection and just experience, have fun, starting off there. But one of my initiatives is creating an advocacy program for young girls where they will be paired with a mentor, will visit these water bodies in person, see them, learn about the histories, and then instead of having me go to these public meetings and speak to why this is important, why access is important, have the young people do it. And I'm relatively young myself, I know that. But having the young people do that and be the ones at the podiums advocating for their waterways, I think is extremely powerful. So at a certain point, I kind of, may go into politics, but for now, I definitely want to find those resources and kind of share the wealth. So.
All right, so Steve and Tanasia, we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap.
Yeah,
up.
and I have a final question
Oh.
too, so that's two.
Okay.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, and it's such a wonderful model of outdoor environmental education. You talked about the data that students are collecting out at the research stations. If you could say more about whether and how students are using these data to inform policy, maybe some of the projects that they presented at the science symposia that you mentioned, and you showed a picture of a student who's studying marine policy. How is this folding into students' education into marine policy making?
Yeah, definitely. So not all of the students who are participating in Billion Oyster Project's work is just prefacing this by saying it's marine science related. So there are students who are interested. For example, there's a group of students who are looking at helicopters. So there's an initiative called Stop the Chop. And so all around the waterfront, or mostly in Lower Manhattan, there are these helicopters that people can essentially go around to and take a helicopter ride around the city. But it's getting to the point where it's become a little disruptive for, not only city dwellers, but we're looking at, the students are looking at if the noise pollution that, is from the helicopters will impact marine life. And so they have installed these monitors. One is actually in our office window where, once again, we have space near the waterfront that will look at the noise pollution around the area. So it's a new study, but looking at this Stop the Chop and marine systems and using a field station as a location where they can install this device to see where the noise pollution is happening is one of the initiatives that students are using our field stations as a way to kind of like advocate for less noise pollution. There was another student who was really interested in learning about, the pollutants that are at the bottom of the harbor. So in one of his symposium projects, he took sediment from various water bodies and began to look at the contents of the pollution at the bottom of our harbors and what types of structures or things we can place at the bottom so that we have safe entryways if we're wading into the water. Once again, one of our biggest advocacy tools is through our water quality. More people, once again, are beginning to use our harbors for boating, for swimming. There's even a developer who wants to create sort of like a beach shoreline. And before we can actually say, okay, this is going to be a place where people can swim, we want to know, is it safe to swim? And so New York Harbor is a location where you can swim, but once again, not after heavy rainstorm. So they're using the data to affect or impact the things that, or influence the things that they're really interested in. And so one of the things that I also speak to students about when I was studying marine science is kind of like, I don't want to study something that I'm not interested in. Just because others say that it's cool or that it's interesting doesn't mean that it's something I want to study. So thinking about diversifying the types of questions that we ask, thinking about the communities that we come from is a huge part of research. I think we were talking about the stories yesterday. So thinking about the community that you came from, your well-being, what's important to you, and how you can use the tools that we give you to influence and do that research is something that I definitely encourage students to do. So we get research from marine science to more social issues, even down to like using humor as a way to combat climate change. So humor and banter as a way to talk about these issues. So I've seen a large array of ways that students have used the data.
Well, you all know that Sean's saying if we had time for one more question meant we should stop. This conversation could go 1,000 directions, and I have to look over Tanasia's shoulder to see the marvelous juxtaposition of the Summer Institute and National Geographic. Good on COA. Just with the utmost respect and gratitude, thank you, Tanasia, for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
We can sit. He may go on.
Just a few closing points. First, Tanasia and I, we were supposed to swim at 8:30 this morning, and I totally dropped the ball on that, so I'm going to fix that. We're going to hit the water at some point. We're not finished with the discussion of bivalves, because on Friday morning we're talking about more locally based aquaculture in Frenchman Bay, so that'll be fun. Don't forget, Governor Mills is also going to be here on Friday afternoon, so if you have any questions you'd like to ask the governor about any not-to-be-named large aquaculture project, you can do that. I will say, Murray Fisher's awesome, really cool guy, and when I first got here as president, I went to Governor's Island. You might have been a student there when I was there. I forget what year you were there. But my dream was to set a College of the Atlantic campus down also on Governor's Island. But that real estate is very, very much sought after, let's just say that. But it's still in there. I just like one word that has come up twice now out of two times, and will come back tomorrow or this evening, is restoration. And it's a tough word because it's loaded with some things, because it begs the question, to what end, right? And who gets to decide that, and for whose benefit? And so this evening at 5 o'clock, we're going to be talking about questions surrounding the restoration of the North Atlantic right whale population, and what that means in the face of a very powerful and important economic industry in the lobstering industry here on the Gulf of Maine. So come back for sure at 5 and help me and help others think about this concept of restoration. But I'll stop there and just say, Tanasia, thank you so much for coming to the College of the Atlantic, and let's hit the water. All right.